The dust storm came without warning on that scorching August afternoon in 1878, and Martha Hayes threw herself over her youngest daughter just as the wagon wheels splintered beneath them, sending their last possessions tumbling across the unforgiving Nevada desert. She had been traveling for 3 weeks since burying her husband Robert in a shallow grave outside Tucson, where fever had taken him despite her desperate prayers. And now, she found herself stranded 15 miles outside Paradise with 4 hungry children and a broken wagon that might as well have been kindling. The wind howled like something alive and angry, tearing at her black mourning dress and filling her mouth with grit when she tried to call out to her sons. But through the swirling brown chaos, she could see them huddled together near the remaining wheel, their faces masks of terror and exhaustion. When the storm finally passed an hour later, Martha sat in the settling dust and took inventory of their situation with the cold practicality that widowhood had forced upon her. Thomas was 11, old enough to understand the gravity of their circumstances, but young enough to still look at her with eyes that expected salvation. Peter was 9 and had not spoken more than a handful of words since watching his father die. The twins, Sarah and Susan, were only 6 years old, still asking when Papa would wake up despite her patient explanations that heaven meant forever. The wagon was beyond repair without proper tools and timber. They had perhaps 2 days of water left in the canteens if they were careful, and the food consisted of dried beef that had grown moldy in the heat, and a handful of flour that had spilled across the desert floor during the wagon's collapse. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling from exhaustion and fear she refused to show her children, and looked toward the horizon where Paradise supposedly waited. Robert had spoken of it during his final fevered hours, insisting that his cousin had settled there and would help them start fresh, would give them land and opportunity. Martha had clung to that promise like a drowning woman clutches driftwood, but now she wondered if her husband's delirium had painted a picture that existed only in his dying mind. They could not stay here. The desert sun would kill them as surely as thirst. She would have to leave the wagon and most of their belongings behind, would have to march her children across 15 miles of barren landscape with only what they could carry. "Thomas, Peter," she called, her voice raspy from dust and fear. "Help me gather what we can take. We walk to Paradise." Thomas looked at the broken wagon, at the scattered remnants of their former life, and his young face crumpled for just a moment before he mastered himself. "Yes, Mama." They salvaged what they could: 3 canteens of water, a bundle of clothes tied with rope, the family Bible that had belonged to Martha's grandmother, a small pot and 2 tin cups, Robert's hunting knife, which Thomas wore on his belt with a solemnity that made Martha's heart ache. She fashioned a crude sling from a shawl to carry Susan, who was the smallest and weakest of the twins, while Sarah walked holding Martha's skirt with determined little fists. They began walking as the sun climbed higher, turning the Nevada landscape into a furnace that seemed designed specifically to break the human spirit. Martha sang hymns to keep their spirits up, old songs her own mother had taught her back in Ohio when life had been simple and death had seemed like something that happened to other people. The boys walked ahead, their skinny shoulders bent under small packs, while Sarah trudged along without complaint. Susan dozed against Martha's shoulder, her breath hot against her mother's neck, mercifully unaware of the desperation that clawed at Martha's throat with every step. By midday they had covered perhaps 4 miles, and Martha knew with grim certainty that they would not reach Paradise before nightfall. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scrub brush and the occasional rock formation that offered no shelter from the punishing heat. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. The children had stopped asking for water after she had allowed them each one small sip, understanding in that intuitive way of children that their mother was rationing their survival. She was considering whether to push forward or find shade and wait for cooler evening temperatures when Thomas shouted and pointed toward the north. At first, Martha saw nothing but heat shimmer and her own desperate hope playing tricks on her vision, but then she spotted it to a rider, moving parallel to their path perhaps half a mile distant. Her heart lurched with possibility and terror in equal measure. The Wild West was not kind to unprotected women, and she had heard stories enough to make her cautious. But they were dying out here, slowly but surely, and any chance was better than none. She pulled the revolver from her skirt pocket, the weight of it familiar from countless nights camping during their journey west, and fired 2 shots into the air. The sound cracked across the empty landscape like judgment itself. For a long moment, nothing changed, and Martha felt tears of frustration building behind her eyes. Then the rider changed direction, turning toward them, and she could only stand there with her children clustering around her skirts and pray that she had not just summoned something worse than the desert's slow death. The rider approached at an easy canter, and as he drew closer, Martha could make out details that did nothing to calm her racing heart. He was tall in the saddle, wearing dusty brown leather chaps over denim pants and a shirt that might have been blue once but had faded to the color of clouds. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, and she could see the glint of a rifle in a scabbard attached to his saddle. But it was the way he rode that gave her pause, not the aggressive posture of a man looking for trouble, but the relaxed competence of someone who belonged in this harsh landscape, the way a hawk belongs to the sky. He pulled up about 10 feet away and pushed his hat back, revealing a face that looked to be in his late 20s, weathered by sun and wind but marked with features that suggested both strength and an unexpected gentleness around the eyes. Those eyes were a startling gray, like storm clouds, and they took in the scene before him with quick intelligence: the exhausted woman in a torn mourning dress, 4 children in various states of collapse, the clear evidence of desperation written in every line of their postures. "Name is Quincy Sutton, madam," he said, his voice a low drawl that somehow managed to sound respectful despite the informality. "You folks appear to be in some difficulty." Martha straightened her spine despite the exhaustion that made her bones feel like water. "Martha Hayes. These are my children. Our wagon broke 15 miles back in the storm. We are trying to reach Paradise." Quincy dismounted in one fluid motion and pulled a canteen from his saddle, walking forward slowly as though approaching skittish animals. "Paradise is still 11 miles ahead, madam." "May I offer the children some water? I have plenty and know where to refill." The casual kindness of the gesture broke something in Martha's careful control. She nodded mutely, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat, and watched as this stranger knelt in the dust and offered water to her children with a gentleness she had not expected. Thomas drank deeply, then Peter, and finally the twins, who stared at Quincy with wide eyes as though he might be an angel descended from heaven itself. "Thank you," Martha managed when Quincy finally straightened and offered the canteen to her. She drank sparingly, forcing herself to stop after a few swallows despite her body's screaming need for more. "We do not have money to pay you." Something flickered across Quincy's face, gone too quickly for Martha to identify. "Did not ask for payment, madam. Though I am curious about your situation. You mentioned a wagon." "My husband died 3 weeks ago," Martha said flatly, having learned that stating facts without emotion was the only way to speak of it without falling apart. "Fever. We were traveling to Paradise where his cousin supposedly settled." The storm broke our wagon this morning. Quincy was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes assessing her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow was not. Jackson Hayes was your husband. Martha felt her heart stutter. You knew of him. His cousin Matthew Hayes runs the general store in Paradise. Good man. He has been watching for you, asking riders to keep an eye out. Quincy looked at the children again, then back at Martha, and something shifted in his expression. Madam, you cannot walk to Paradise in this heat with 4 young ones. The desert will kill you before sunset. I have no choice, Martha said, hearing the edge of hysteria in her own voice and hating it. The wagon is broken beyond repair. We have no money for passage on a stage, even if one came through. I must get my children to safety. Quincy took off his hat and ran a hand through hair that was dark brown and badly in need of cutting. He looked at his horse, at the children, at Martha, and she saw him working through some calculation in his mind. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but absolutely certain. I have room for 5. Martha stared at him, not understanding. I do not comprehend your meaning. My ranch is 3 miles north of here. Small place, but sturdy. I work cattle for the bigger spreads and do some horse trading. Built myself a decent 4-room house last year, more space than one man needs. He met her eyes directly, and Martha saw no deception there, only honest intent. You and your children can stay there while you sort yourselves out. No cost, no expectations beyond helping with some cooking and such if you are able. When you are ready, I will take you into Paradise to find Matthew Hayes. It was too generous, too convenient, and every instinct Martha possessed screamed that men did not offer such things without expecting something in return. But as she looked at her children, at their sunburned faces and exhausted eyes, at little Susan who had started crying softly from sheer misery, she understood that she had no choice but to trust this stranger or watch her babies die in the desert. Why would you do this? She asked, needing to hear his reasoning even if it was a lie. Quincy's expression grew distant for a moment, as though looking at something far away in time or space. Had a sister once. She died trying to cross the desert with her husband and baby after their wagon broke down. Found them too late to matter. Figure I owe the universe a debt for that. The raw honesty of it hit Martha like a physical blow. She saw the truth of old grief in the set of his shoulders, in the way he would not quite meet her eyes as he spoke of it, and she understood that his offer came from a place of genuine compassion rather than opportunism. I accept, she said quietly, with gratitude. Quincy nodded once, then turned to practical matters with the efficiency of a man accustomed to solving problems. He lifted Susan onto his horse first, then Sarah in front of her, instructing them to hold tight to the saddle horn. Thomas and Peter, he had walk alongside, one hand on the stirrup to help them keep pace. Martha walked on the other side, and Quincy led the horse with the reins, setting a pace that was slow enough for the walkers but steady enough to cover ground. They traveled in relative silence, Martha too overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of their fortunes to make small talk, and Quincy seeming comfortable with quiet. The children rallied slightly now that they had water and hope, and Martha heard Thomas asking Peter if he thought the ranch would have chickens. Such a simple thing, the wondering of a boy, but it made tears burn at the back of Martha's eyes because it meant her son still had the capacity to think about something beyond immediate survival. Quincy's ranch appeared first as a dark smudge against the horizon, then gradually resolved into something more substantial, a low house built of timber and adobe, a barn that looked sturdy despite its weathered boards, and a series of corrals that currently held about a dozen horses. It was modest by any standard, but after weeks of sleeping under a wagon and then contemplating death in the desert, it looked to Martha like a palace. "It is not much," Quincy said as they approached, the first words he had spoken in over an hour. "But it is solid and cool inside. Well is good and clean. You and the girls can take the bedroom. I will bunk in the barn with the boys until we sort out something better." "You will not sleep in a barn on our account," Martha protested automatically. "We cannot displace you from your own home." Quincy gave her a look that was equal parts amused and stubborn. "Madam, with respect, you are a widow woman with 4 children who nearly died in the desert today. I am a cowboy who has slept in worse places than my own barn. You will take the bedroom, and that is the end of discussion." There was something about his tone, firm but not unkind, that reminded Martha painfully of Robert before the illness took him. She nodded, blinking back tears, and allowed him to help her down from where she had been leaning against the horse's shoulder. The interior of the house was Spartan but clean, and blessedly cool after the inferno of the desert. A main room served as kitchen and living space, with a simple table and 4 chairs, a cookstove that looked well maintained, and shelves that held basic supplies. 2 doors led off the main room, one to the bedroom Quincy had mentioned, which contained a real bed with a corn husk mattress and actual pillows, and another to what appeared to be a small storage room. A 3rd door opened to the outside at the back of the house. "There is a creek about 50 yards that way," Quincy said, pointing through the rear door. "Good for washing. I will bring up water from the well for drinking and cooking. Outhouse is beyond the barn. I have some salt pork and beans, flour for biscuits if you know how to make them. Chickens usually give me more eggs than I can eat alone." Thomas turned to Peter with a triumphant expression that spoke louder than words, and even Peter almost smiled. Martha found her voice, though it came out thick with emotion. "Mr. Sutton, I do not know how to repay this kindness." "No repayment needed, madam. Just see to your children and rest. You all look about ready to fall over." He paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and added quietly, "I am sorry for your loss. Jackson was a good man by all accounts. Matthew speaks highly of him." Then he was gone, leaving Martha and her children standing in the cool dimness of his house. And Martha finally allowed herself to sink into one of the chairs and put her face in her hands. She did not quite cry, but she allowed herself a moment of overwhelming relief before Thomas touched her shoulder gently. "Mama, should I help Sarah and Susan wash up?" She looked up at her eldest son, at the way he was trying so hard to be the man of the family now, and felt her heart break and swell simultaneously. "Yes, Thomas. Take Peter with you. Be careful near the creek." When the children had gone, Martha stood and explored the small kitchen area, taking stock of what Quincy had available. He had been modest in his description. There was plenty of food for a bachelor, and more than enough to feed her family for several days. She found the salt pork he had mentioned, along with dried beans, cornmeal, flour, sugar, coffee, and even a small crock of molasses. The cookstove was clean and well maintained, with a good supply of wood stacked nearby. Her hands moved automatically, falling into the familiar rhythms of preparing a meal. She had been cooking since she was younger than Susan, first helping her mother in Ohio, then managing her own household after marrying Robert. The motions were soothing, mindless work that allowed her thoughts to settle. Quincy Sutton. She turned the name over in her mind, examining this stranger who had rescued them so unexpectedly. He was younger than Robert had been, probably close to her own 26 years, and there was a capability about him that spoke of a man who had learned self-sufficiency early. The ranch, though small, showed signs of careful maintenance and pride of ownership. He was not wealthy, but neither was he desperate, a working cowboy who had managed to carve out his own small piece of Nevada territory, and he had offered them refuge with no expectation of return. That was the part that Martha kept coming back to, poking at it like a sore tooth. In her experience, people did not give without expecting to receive. But Quincy's explanation about his sister had rung with genuine grief, the kind that did not fade even when the years passed. She was stirring beans when the children returned, cleaner and considerably more cheerful. The creek water had been cold, they reported, and there were tiny fish they could see swimming. Thomas had kept close watch on the twins, not letting them near the deeper parts, and Peter had collected smooth stones that he now showed Martha with something approaching enthusiasm. "That is wonderful, dear," Martha said, running a hand through Peter's still damp hair. "Why do you not set the table? Mr. Sutton will be hungry when he returns." But Quincy did not return for dinner. Martha waited, keeping the food warm until Sarah fell asleep in her chair, and Thomas could barely keep his eyes open. Finally, she fed her children and put them to bed, all four crowding into the large bed in the bedroom while Martha made herself a pallet on the floor beside them. She was asleep almost before her head touched the rolled-up blanket she was using as a pillow. She woke once in the deep night and heard the low sound of Quincy's voice outside, speaking to the horses, and felt a strange sense of security knowing he was nearby. Then sleep claimed her again, deeper and more restful than any she had known since Robert's death. Morning came with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Martha woke disoriented, unsure for a moment where she was, then remembered in a rush that left her breathless. She untangled herself from Susan's sprawling limbs and went into the main room to find Quincy at the stove, managing breakfast with the competence of someone accustomed to cooking for himself. "Morning, madam," he said without turning around. "Hope I did not wake you. Figure you needed rest more than anything." "You should have let me cook," Martha said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks at the impropriety of a man cooking for her. "That is the least I can do. Plenty of time for that. Today you are a guest." He turned and handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "How did the children sleep?" "Like stones. The bed is very comfortable. Too comfortable you should not have given it up." Quincy shrugged, flipping bacon with a fork. "Barn is fine. Slept in worse, like I said." They stood in slightly awkward silence, Martha sipping her coffee and trying not to notice how different Quincy looked in morning light. He had shaved, she realized, and his hair was still damp as though he had ducked his head in the horse trough. There was something intimate about sharing morning coffee with a man who was essentially a stranger, something that made her acutely aware that she was a woman alone, and he was uncommonly decent. The children woke one by one, drawn by the smell of food, and the small house came alive with their presence. Quincy watched them with an expression Martha could not quite read, something between wistfulness and warmth. He let Thomas pepper him with questions about the horses and asked Peter about his stone collection with genuine interest. He cut Sarah's bacon into small pieces without being asked and poured Susan a cup of milk from the can in the cold box. After breakfast, Quincy announced he had work to do checking fence lines but would return by midday. "Make yourselves at home," he said as he settled his hat on his head. "There are books on that shelf if anyone likes reading. Creek is good for cooling off this afternoon when it gets hot. I will bring in extra water before I go." Then he was gone, leaving Martha alone with her children in a stranger's house, and the strangeness of their situation settled over her like a cloak. 3 days ago, she had been desperately trying to coax a dying wagon across the desert. Yesterday, she had been preparing to watch her children die of thirst and exposure. Today, she was standing in a kitchen with a full stomach and her children safe, rescued by a cowboy who asked nothing in return. She spent the morning cleaning, unable to simply rest when there was work to be done. The house was already remarkably clean for a bachelor's dwelling, but she scrubbed the floors and washed the windows and organized the shelves with a thoroughness born of nervous energy. Thomas and Peter swept out the barn without being asked, returning with stories about the horses and a small orange kitten that had tried to climb Peter's leg. By noon, when Quincy returned, the house gleamed and Martha had stew simmering on the stove. He stopped in the doorway, looking around with an expression of bemused surprise. "You did not have to do all this," he said, but there was pleasure in his voice that suggested he was not displeased. "I cannot sit idle when there is work to be done," Martha replied, ladling stew into bowls. "You have given us so much. It is little enough return." They fell into an easy pattern over the next few days. Quincy would rise early and work his ranch, checking on cattle for the larger spreads that paid him, training horses, maintaining equipment and buildings. Martha would cook and clean, and found herself naturally taking over the management of the household in a way that felt both strange and comfortable. The children bloomed under the security of routine and regular meals, their resilience astounding Martha even as it broke her heart. On the third evening, after the children had gone to bed, Martha found Quincy sitting on the porch watching the sunset. She joined him hesitantly, unsure of the propriety but needing to speak with him alone. "Mr. Sutton," she began, but he interrupted gently. "Quincy, please." "Mr. Sutton makes me feel like my father." "Quincy," she amended, the name strange in her mouth. "I need to discuss our situation. We cannot impose on your hospitality indefinitely. Tomorrow I should go into Paradise and find Matthew Hayes." Quincy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon where the sun was painting the desert in shades of orange and purple. "What will you do if Matthew cannot help?" he asked finally. It was the question Martha had been avoiding. "I do not know. Find work, I suppose. I can cook and clean. I am a decent seamstress. Perhaps someone in town needs help. And if no one does, Paradise is small. Opportunities are scarce, especially for a woman with 4 children. Martha felt frustration rise in her chest. "What would you have me do?" "We cannot stay here permanently, living on your charity. It is not proper." "Who decides what is proper?" Quincy turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were very serious. "Martha, I have been thinking. This ranch needs help that I cannot afford to hire. The house needs a woman's touch. Those children need stability and security, and you need a place where you and your family can be safe and fed." Martha's heart began to pound as she understood where he was leading. "I do not take your meaning." "I think you do." Quincy looked away again, and she saw color rising in his neck. "I am proposing a practical arrangement. Marriage, but in name only if that is your preference. You would have security and a home for your children. I would have help with the ranch and the household. No expectations beyond that. Just 2 people helping each other survive." The words hung in the air between them, enormous and impossible and somehow inevitable. Martha's first instinct was to refuse, to be offended by the very suggestion. She had buried her husband barely a month ago. The idea of remarrying so quickly, to a man she had known for only 3 days, was scandalous beyond measure. But then she thought about her children sleeping soundly inside, about Thomas's questions regarding whether they could stay here forever, about little Susan finally looking less like a frightened ghost and more like a normal 6-year-old. She thought about the alternative scraping by on whatever charity she could find, watching her children go hungry, perhaps being forced to split them up and send them to different families who might take 1 child but not 4. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know us. We are strangers. You need help and I can give it. That seems reason enough." Quincy stood and leaned against the porch railing, his back to her. "I am not looking for a love match, Martha. I am 28 years old and have been alone since I was 16. I like my solitude, but this ranch is more than one person can properly manage. You are a widow with children who need a father. We could help each other." "Marriage is not just an economic arrangement," Martha said, but even as she spoke she knew she was arguing against her own desperation. "For some it is. For many, even. How many women in paradise married for security rather than love? How many men married for a helpmate rather than romance?" He turned back to face her. "I am not asking you to love me, Martha. I am asking you to consider a partnership built on mutual benefit and respect. If that is not enough, I understand. But think about what is best for your children before you refuse." He went inside then, leaving Martha alone with the desert night and a proposal that seemed both impossible and like the only sensible option available. She sat on the porch for hours, turning it over in her mind from every angle. Robert had been dead for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. It was indecent to even consider remarrying so quickly. What would people say? What would Robert have thought? But Robert was dead, and Martha was alive with 4 children depending on her. Robert had loved his children more than anything in the world. Would he have wanted her to refuse security for them because of propriety? Would he have expected her to struggle alone when help was offered? She thought about Quincy's steady presence these past few days, the way he treated her children with gentle patience, how he had never once made her feel uncomfortable or threatened despite being alone with him in his house. He was kind and hardworking and honest. He was not Robert, but then no one would ever be Robert. By the time she went inside, Martha had not made a decision, but she knew what her answer would eventually be. She had been raised to believe in love and romance, in marriage as a sacred bond between souls. But she had also been raised to survive, to do what was necessary to protect her family. And sometimes those two things were not compatible. In the morning, she found Quincy already up and working. She made breakfast and called him in, and when the children were eating, she asked him to walk with her outside. He followed without question, and they stood in the early morning coolness with the smell of horses and hay surrounding them. "I will accept your proposal on certain conditions," Martha said without preamble, because delaying would only make it harder. "The children must never know this is merely a practical arrangement. They need to believe this is a real marriage, that you care for them and for me. I will not have them feeling like charity cases or burdens." Quincy nodded slowly. "I can agree to that. What else? You will treat them as your own children, discipline when needed but with kindness. They have been through enough trauma." "Agreed. They are good children, Martha. It would not be hardship. And if someday you decide you want a real marriage, with a woman who can give you love and not just partnership, you will tell me honestly. I will not stand in your way." Something flickered across Quincy's face at that, but he nodded. "If that day comes, I will be honest. Do you have more conditions?" Martha took a deep breath. "No, those are my terms." "Then I accept." Quincy held out his hand, and after a moment Martha took it. His grip was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked hard for everything he had. "We can go into paradise today and speak with the preacher. Unless you want to wait, waiting will only make it harder." Martha met his eyes directly. "Let us do this before I lose my courage." They gathered the children and made the 3-mile journey into paradise. Thomas and Peter riding Quincy's horse, while Quincy drove a small wagon he kept for hauling supplies, with Martha and the twins beside him on the bench seat. Paradise proved to be a small town of perhaps 200 souls, consisting of a main street with a general store, saloon, livery stable, small hotel, and a white-painted church that looked almost absurdly optimistic in the harsh desert landscape. Matthew Hayes proved to be a round man with Robert's eyes and a warm smile that faltered when he saw Martha in her mourning dress. "Martha, is it really you? We heard about Jackson. I am so sorry." "Thank you, Matthew." Martha introduced her children, watching as Matthew greeted each one with genuine warmth. "Your cousin spoke often of you in his final hours. You should have sent word. I would have come to meet you on the road." Matthew's gaze shifted to Quincy with curiosity. "Quincy, good to see you." "Matthew, actually, we have come to speak with Preacher Williams. Martha has agreed to marry me." The shock on Matthew's face would have been comical in other circumstances. His eyes went wide, then narrowed with suspicion, then softened with understanding as he looked at Martha's tired face and her 4 children clustering around her skirts. "I see," he said carefully. "Well, that is wonderful news. Unexpected but wonderful. Quincy is a good man, Martha. He will treat you right." They found Preacher Williams in the church, and he proved to be a lean man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He listened to their request without visible judgment, though Martha felt her cheeks burning with shame at the impropriety of it all. "This is quite sudden," the preacher said finally. "Martha, you have only recently been widowed. Are you certain this is what you want?" "I am certain it is what I need," Martha replied honestly. "My children need security. Mr. Sutton has offered that. I would be a fool to refuse." Preacher Williams looked at Quincy. "And you, son, you understand what you are taking on. 4 children is a heavy responsibility." "I understand fully, preacher. I would not have offered if I was not prepared to honor the commitment." The preacher studied them both for a long moment, and Martha forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. I will perform the ceremony, but I want you both to understand that marriage is a sacred covenant, not just a legal arrangement. Whatever your reasons for entering into it, you must treat it with the respect and faithfulness it deserves." "We understand," Quincy said quietly. The ceremony was brief and simple. Martha stood beside Quincy in her worn mourning dress, feeling surreal and disconnected from her own body. Thomas held Susan while Sarah clung to Peter, all 4 children watching with wide, confused eyes. Matthew Hayes served as witness, and when Preacher Williams asked if anyone objected, the silence felt heavy with unspoken concerns. "Do you, Quincy Sutton, take Martha Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do." Quincy's voice was steady, and when Martha glanced at him, she saw his jaw was set with determination. "Do you, Martha Hayes, take Quincy Sutton to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Martha thought of Robert, buried in the Arizona desert. Thought of the vows she had made to him 12 years ago when she had been barely more than a girl. Thought of her children and the desperation that had brought her to this moment. "I do. Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Nevada and Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Quincy bent and pressed a chaste kiss to Martha's forehead, so brief and impersonal it could not possibly offend anyone's propriety. But Martha felt the touch like a brand, marking the moment when her life changed irrevocably once again. They signed the marriage certificate with Matthew as witness, and then it was done. Martha Hayes had become Martha Sutton, wife to a man she had known for less than a week, stepmother delivered into a life she had not chosen but could not refuse. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the children subdued by the strangeness of the day. When Sarah asked in a small voice if Quincy was their papa now, Martha felt her throat close with emotion. "Mr. Sutton is your stepfather," she managed. "He has been very kind to us." "You can call me Quincy," he told the children. "Or Pa if you are comfortable with that. Whatever feels right." That night, after the children were asleep, Quincy made himself a bedroll in the main room rather than going to the barn. "Now that we are married, it would look strange if I continued sleeping separate," he explained quietly. "But I will stay out here. The bedroom is still yours." Martha nodded, grateful for his consideration even as she felt the weight of their new reality settling around her shoulders. She was married again, bound legally and religiously to a man she barely knew, and every instinct screamed that she had made a terrible mistake, even as her rational mind insisted she had done the only sensible thing. She lay awake long into the night, listening to Quincy's breathing from the main room and the soft sounds of her children sleeping around her, and tried to imagine what came next. The days began to blend together in a pattern that was both foreign and increasingly comfortable. Martha rose early and made breakfast while Quincy tended to the animals. They ate together, all 6 of them crowded around the small table that Quincy had already started modifying to be larger. Then, Quincy would go about his ranch work while Martha managed the household and minded the children. It was a strange existence, simultaneously more intimate than Martha was comfortable with and more distant than a real marriage should be. They were polite with each other, cordial even, but there was a careful space between them that neither seemed willing to breach. They did not touch beyond what was necessary. They did not share confidences or private jokes. They existed together like 2 dancers who had learned the steps, but not yet found the rhythm. The children adapted more quickly than Martha had anticipated. Thomas began following Quincy around like a shadow, eager to learn about horses and cattle and the 100 tasks required to maintain a working ranch. Peter emerged from his shell of silence, not all at once but gradually, asking Quincy questions about the desert wildlife and listening with rapt attention to the answers. The twins simply bloomed, their natural cheerfulness returning as the trauma of their father's death and the desperate journey began to fade into memory. For them, it seemed, Quincy's presence was uncomplicated. He was kind and patient and answered their endless questions without irritation. He taught Thomas to rope and let Peter help with feeding the horses. He carved small dolls for the twins from pieces of scrap wood and spent an entire evening explaining to Sarah why the sky turned colors at sunset. He was, Martha realized with something between gratitude and guilt, exactly the kind of father they needed. But for Martha, nothing was simple. Every day she felt the weight of her deception, allowing her children to believe this was a real marriage when it was nothing more than a business arrangement. Every night, she lay alone in the bedroom that should have been the marriage bed and wondered what she had become. She had been raised to believe in love and honor and the sanctity of marriage vows. Now she was living a lie, and it ate at her like acid. 2 weeks after the wedding, she was kneading bread dough when Quincy came in with a nasty cut on his arm from a piece of barbed wire. Without thinking, Martha dropped the dough and rushed to him, her heart pounding with sudden fear. "Sit down," she ordered, already reaching for clean cloth and the whiskey Quincy kept for medicinal purposes. "Let me see how deep it is." "It is nothing," Quincy protested, but he sat anyway, watching with bemused surprise as Martha cleaned the wound with efficient gentleness. Her hands were shaking slightly, she realized, and forced them to steadiness. "It could become infected," she said, wrapping the cut with clean bandages. "You must keep it clean and dry. If it shows any sign of fever or red streaks, we need to see a doctor immediately." When she looked up, She found Quincy watching her with an expression she could not decipher. "You were worried about me." It was not a question, but Martha found herself answering anyway. "Of course I was worried. Infection can kill as surely as a bullet. Robert's fever started with a small cut he dismissed as nothing. Thank you for tending to it." Quincy's voice was soft, and there was something in his eyes that made Martha suddenly, acutely aware of how close they were standing, of her hand still resting on his arm, of the fact that they were alone in the house while the children played by the creek. She stepped back quickly, returning to her bread dough with unnecessary vigor. "You should be more careful. You have responsibilities now." "I know what my responsibilities are, Martha." There was an edge to his voice that made her look up sharply, but his face was neutral, giving nothing away. They finished the day in the same careful politeness that had become their norm, but something had shifted. Some line had been crossed that Martha could not quite identify. That night, she lay awake thinking about the fear that had gripped her when she saw Quincy's blood. The way her heart had stuttered with genuine terror at the thought of him being seriously hurt. She told herself it was natural she depended on him now, and his well-being directly affected her children's security. But there had been something more personal in her reaction, something that had nothing to do with practical concerns and everything to do with the man himself. She was, Martha realized with dawning horror, beginning to care for Quincy Sutton. Not as a benefactor or even a friend, but as a woman cares for a man. It was impossible and inappropriate and completely counter to their agreement. This was supposed to be a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience. Feelings were not part of the arrangement, but hearts, Martha knew, did not follow rules or respect agreements. Hearts did what they wanted, regardless of propriety or sense. The next morning she was distant with Quincy, protecting herself with coolness because she did not know what else to do. If he noticed, he gave no sign, simply went about his work as usual. But Thomas mentioned that evening that Quincy seemed sad, and Martha felt guilt twist in her stomach. "Why do you say that?" she asked, helping Thomas with his reading lessons. "He was quiet today. Usually he talks more, tells me stories about when he was young. Today he just worked and did not say much." Thomas looked up at her with his two perceptive eyes. "Did you and Pa fight?" The casual use of Pa made Martha's heart clench. "No, sweetheart, we did not fight. Sometimes adults are just quiet." But she knew Thomas did not believe her, and that night when Quincy came in for dinner, she made an effort to be warmer, to smile at him and ask about his day. His surprise was evident, but he responded in kind, and soon they were talking about plans to expand the chicken coop and whether Thomas was old enough to have his own horse. "He is very responsible," Martha said, "and he loves the animals. I think he could handle the responsibility. Then we will look for a suitable gelding when I go to the horse auction next month." Quincy glanced at Thomas, who was listening with barely contained excitement. "But you will have to earn it. Morning and evening chores, no complaints for the next month. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." Thomas practically vibrated with joy. "I promise, I will work so hard." Watching them, Martha felt warmth spread through her chest. This was what she had wanted for her children's stability, kindness, a father figure who cared about them. Quincy was giving them that and more. He was giving them hope and a future. That night after the children were in bed, Martha found Quincy on the porch again, and she joined him as had become her habit. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert coyotes in the distance, the rustle of horses in the corral, the whisper of wind through sage brush. "I am sorry if I was short with you this morning," Martha said finally. "I was not angry with you. I was angry with myself." Quincy turned to look at her, his face partially shadowed in the starlight. "Why would you be angry with yourself? Martha chose her words carefully. "I am struggling with the nature of our arrangement. It seemed so simple when we made the agreement, but nothing about this is simple." "No," Quincy agreed quietly. "It is not. Martha, I know this is not what you would have chosen if circumstances were different. I know you married me out of necessity, not desire. I am trying to give you space to not make you uncomfortable. But if I am doing something wrong, I need you to tell me." "You are not doing anything wrong." Martha turned to face him fully. "That is part of what makes this so difficult. You are kind and patient and wonderful with my children. You have given us everything and asked for nothing in return. I feel guilty that I cannot give you what a real wife should give her husband." "I did not ask for that," Quincy said, but there was something strained in his voice. "I told you from the beginning that I did not expect a love match." "I know what you said. But you deserve more than a business arrangement. You deserve a wife who cares for you, who wants to be with you, not someone who married you out of desperation." "And what if I told you that having you here, having the children, having this house feel like a home instead of just a place I sleep, what if I told you that is more than enough?" Martha's breath caught in her throat. "Quincy, I am not asking you to feel anything you do not feel," he continued, his words coming faster now as though he needed to get them out before he lost his courage. "But I need you to understand that this arrangement is not a hardship for me. Yes, I offered help because I could and because of what happened to my sister. But I have not regretted a single moment of having you here. Not one." They stared at each other in the darkness, and Martha felt the careful walls she had built around her heart beginning to crack. This man, this good and decent man, was telling her that she and her children were enough, that their presence brought him joy rather than burden. "I do not know how to do this," she whispered. "I do not know how to be married to you when I am still grieving Robert. I do not know how to care for you when part of my heart is still buried in the Arizona desert." Quincy reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. It was the first time they had touched deliberately since the brief kiss after their wedding vows, and Martha felt electricity shoot up her arm at the contact. "You do not have to know how," he said gently. "We will figure it out together one day at a time. No expectations, no pressure. Just two people trying to build something good for those children sleeping inside." Martha looked at their joined hands, at the contrast of his weathered, calloused fingers against her smaller, paler ones, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This was her husband. Not in the way Robert had been, perhaps never in that way, but her husband nonetheless. And maybe that was enough. Maybe they could build something meaningful from this strange foundation of necessity and mutual respect. "One day at a time," she repeated softly. "I think I can manage that." They sat together for a while longer, hands still joined, and when Martha finally went inside to sleep, she felt lighter than she had in months. The weeks turned into months, and summer's heat gradually gave way to autumn's cooler temperatures. Martha found herself falling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. She took over the kitchen garden Quincy had neglected, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn Nevada soil. She learned to make cheese and butter, to preserve food for the winter, to bake bread in the temperamental oven until she could produce loaves as good as any she had made back in Ohio. The children thrived. Thomas got his horse, a gentle bay gelding he named Copper, and took to riding with the natural ease of youth. He was growing tall and strong from ranch work, losing the gauntness that had marked him after Robert's death. Peter, quieter but no less enthusiastic, developed a special way with the chickens and declared himself in charge of egg collection and chicken welfare. The twins were simply happy, running wild in the desert landscape under Thomas's watchful eye, collecting treasures and telling elaborate stories. and Martha found herself watching Quincy with increasing frequency and warmth. The way he always put the children's needs first, giving Thomas his full attention when the boy needed guidance, listening to Peter's long, rambling stories about the chickens without interruption, playing elaborate games with the twins that left him exhausted but smiling. The way he worked from sunrise to sunset without complaint, building this life for all of them. The way he looked at her sometimes across the dinner table, with an expression that was part admiration and part longing and entirely respectful of the boundaries she had established. She began to find excuses to touch him, a hand on his shoulder as she passed behind him, fixing his collar before he went into town, standing closer than strictly necessary when they worked together. Small things, but deliberate, testing this new territory between them. Quincy responded in kind, carefully and slowly, as though afraid of spooking her. He began bringing her small gifts from town, a length of fabric she admired, a bar of sweet-smelling soap, a book of poetry. He taught her to ride using a mare he had trained specifically for her, his hand steadying her waist as she learned to balance. He told her stories about his childhood, about his sister who had died, about the years of loneliness before she and the children had arrived. One evening in late October, Martha was cleaning up after dinner when Quincy came up behind her with Thomas's reading primer in his hand. "Thomas is doing well with his lessons," he said. "You have taught him excellently. He is bright and eager to learn." It is easy to teach a child who wants to be taught. Martha dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him. "He looks up to you tremendously, you know. You are becoming the father he needed. I hope so. I want to be worthy of that trust." Quincy hesitated, then added, "All of them are wonderful children, Martha. You have raised them to be kind and hardworking and good. You should be proud." "Robert and I raised them together," Martha said softly. "He was a good father. I am sure he was." Quincy's eyes were serious. "I am not trying to replace him, Martha. I know I cannot. But I hope I can give all of you, something worth having." Martha looked at this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, who had offered refuge when she had nothing, who had taken on 4 children and a grieving widow without hesitation. She thought about the careful distance they had maintained for months, the walls she had built to protect her heart, and she realized that those walls were no longer necessary if they ever had been. "You have already given us everything," she said, stepping closer to him. "More than I ever expected or hoped for. Quincy, I need to tell you something." He waited, patient as always, and Martha took a deep breath. "When we married, I thought this would always be just an arrangement. I thought I would never feel anything beyond gratitude and perhaps friendship. But I was wrong." She reached up and touched his face gently, feeling the scrape of stubble beneath her palm. "I care for you, Quincy, not as a benefactor or a convenient husband, but as a man, as my husband. And it terrifies me because I do not know if you want that, if you want more than our agreement." For a long moment Quincy stood frozen, his eyes searching hers as though looking for deception or doubt. Then he covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. "Martha, I have wanted more since the day I saw you standing in the desert fighting to save your children. I have wanted more every morning when I wake up knowing you are in the next room, every evening when I watch you with the children, every moment of every day. But I did not want to pressure you, did not want you to feel obligated. I do not feel obligated." Martha smiled, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I feel grateful and confused and hopeful and terrified, but not obligated. Quincy, I think I am falling in love with you, and I do not know what to do with that." "Well," Quincy said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have a suggestion." He bent slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and kissed her properly for the first time. Not the chaste peck from their wedding day, but a real kiss, tender and searching and full of months of careful restraint finally breaking free. Martha melted into it, her arms going around his neck, and felt something click into place inside her, something she had not even realized was broken. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I have for weeks, maybe months. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you sing when you think no one is listening. I love how fierce you are protecting your children and how gentle you are with them. I love everything about you, Martha Sutton." Martha laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and tears. "This is not how I imagined this going." "How did you imagine it?" "I did not. I was too afraid to imagine it at all." She pulled back to look at him properly. "What do we do now?" "Now," Quincy said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, "we stop sleeping in separate rooms. We start building a real marriage, a real family. We love each other openly instead of dancing around it, if that is what you want." "It is what I want," Martha said firmly. "It is absolutely what I want." That night, Martha moved her belongings into the bedroom properly, and when Quincy joined her there was no awkwardness, only rightness. They lay together talking late into the night, sharing histories and dreams and fears they had kept locked away. Quincy told her about his lonely years building the ranch alone, about his fear that he would always be isolated. Martha told him about her first marriage, about loving Robert but also about the ways it had been difficult, about her terror when he died and left her alone with 4 children in a hostile land. "I feel guilty sometimes," she admitted in the darkness, "for being happy with you when Robert has been dead for less than 6 months. What kind of wife forgets her husband so quickly?" "You have not forgotten him," Quincy said, pulling her closer against his side. "You honor him by caring for his children, by keeping his memory alive for them. But Martha, he would not have wanted you to stop living. He would have wanted you to find happiness again." "How do you know?" "Because if I died, I would want you to find happiness. I would want you and the children to be cared for and loved. That is what you do when you love someone. You want their happiness even if you cannot be part of it." Martha pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him leather and soap and something uniquely Quincy. "I do love you," she whispered. "I need you to know that. This is not convenience or gratitude. This is real." "I know," Quincy said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I know, my love." They did not make love that night, both understanding without words that Martha needed more time before taking that final step. But they held each other, and that was enough, more than enough. It was the beginning of something new and precious, built on the ashes of Martha's old life, but growing into something entirely its own. Winter came to Nevada with surprising fierceness. The desert, so brutal in its summer heat, transformed into a landscape of cold winds and occasional snow. Quincy worked to ensure they had enough firewood and that the animals were sheltered. Martha put up every bit of food she could preserve, filling the small root cellar with vegetables and preserved fruits, with smoked meat and stores of grain. The forced proximity of winter brought them even closer. Cold nights meant huddling together under quilts, talking by firelight while the wind howled outside. It meant teaching the children to read and write by lamplight, playing games to pass the long evenings, telling stories and singing songs. The house felt truly like a home now, filled with warmth and laughter and love. On Christmas morning, Martha woke to find Quincy already up, stoking the fire and preparing a special breakfast. The children tumbled out of their beds in the small addition Quincy had built for them that fall, giving Martha and Quincy true privacy. There were small gifts, carved toys for the children, a new dress Martha had sewn for each of the girls, mittens she had knitted for the boys. Quincy gave Martha a music box he had ordered from a catalog, a delicate thing that played a waltz when wound up. "It is too much," Martha protested, but she was blinking back tears. "It is not enough," Quincy replied. "It will never be enough for what you have given me." That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Quincy pulled Martha into his arms and they danced slowly to the tinny music of the music box, turning circles in their small front room with no audience but the stars visible through the window. "I never thought I would be this happy," Martha said softly. "6 months ago I was certain my life was over, that all I had left was survival for my children's sake. And now—" "And now," Quincy prompted, his breath warm against her temple. "Now I have a life I love, with a man I love, and children who are safe and happy. It seems almost too good to be true." "It is real," Quincy assured her. "This is real, Martha, all of it." That night, they made love for the first time, slowly and tenderly, and Martha felt the last pieces of her broken heart finally knit back together. It was different from her experiences with Robert. Quincy was different, more patient, more focused on her pleasure than his own. But it was wonderful in its own right, a physical expression of the emotional bond that had been growing between them for months. Afterwards, lying wrapped in Quincy's arms with her head on his chest, Martha thought about the strange path that had brought her here. The tragedy of Robert's death, the desperate journey across the desert, the moment when Quincy had ridden out of the heat shimmer like an answer to prayer. Every terrible thing that had happened had led her to this moment, to this man, to this life. "What are you thinking?" Quincy asked, his hand stroking through her loose hair. "That life is strange and terrible and wonderful, sometimes all at once." "That is a very profound thought." Martha laughed softly. "I am feeling profound. You have that effect on me. Then I consider that a success." Quincy pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Sleep, love. Tomorrow is another day of this strange, terrible, wonderful life." Spring brought new life to the ranch in more ways than one. The horses Quincy had been training sold for good prices, giving them enough money to expand their operation. They bought more cattle, hired a young cowboy named Jim to help with the heavy work, and began planning additions to the house and barn. Thomas, at 12, was already a competent ranch hand. Peter had developed a surprising talent for training dogs and had 2 working ranch dogs that obeyed his every command. The twins were learning to ride and helping Martha with the household work that seemed to expand infinitely. And Martha discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but waited to be certain before telling Quincy. When she finally found the words, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, a habit they had maintained throughout the seasons. "I have news," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "We are going to need to build another bed for the children's room." Quincy looked at her quizzically. "Why? Are we expecting someone? In about 6 months, yes." She watched understanding dawn on his face, followed by joy so pure and overwhelming that it made her breath catch. He stood suddenly, pulling her up with him, and spun her in a circle while she laughed and protested. "Truly?" he asked when he set her down, his hands framing her face. "You are certain?" "Very certain." "Are you pleased?" "Pleased does not begin to cover it." Quincy kissed her thoroughly, then dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to her still flat stomach. "Hello in there. This is your father speaking. You picked a good mother. She is the strongest woman I know." Martha laughed, running her fingers through his hair. "You are ridiculous." "I am happy. There is a difference." They told the children that evening, and the responses ranged from Thomas's mature pleasure to the twins' excited questions about whether the baby would be a boy or a girl. Peter asked thoughtfully if the baby would like chickens, and seemed satisfied when Quincy assured him that all babies eventually came to appreciate chickens. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. though Martha was often exhausted in the early months. Quincy hovered like an overprotective hen, which Martha found both endearing and exasperating. He insisted she rest more, took over many of her heavier household duties, and generally treated her as though she were made of spun glass. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him one afternoon when he literally swept her off her feet to keep her from lifting a basket of laundry. "I know, but you are precious cargo and I am taking no chances. Quincy, I have done this 4 times before. I know what I can and cannot do. Humor me anyway." She did, because she loved him and because his concern came from a place of genuine care rather than control. And truthfully, it was not terrible to be pampered and fussed over. Robert had been loving during her previous pregnancies, but there had always been an element of anxiety mixed with his joy, another mouth to feed, another child to provide for in an uncertain world. Quincy had no such reservations. He was simply delighted at the prospect of becoming a father. Summer came again, marking a full year since Martha and her children had stumbled into Quincy's life. They held a small anniversary celebration, nothing fancy, just a special dinner and a quiet evening together after the children were in bed. 1 year, Martha said, nestled against Quincy's side. Her belly was round now, the baby active and strong. "It seems both longer and shorter than that. Longer because I cannot remember life before you," Quincy said. "Shorter because I want 1,000 more years just like it. That is very poetic for a cowboy. I am a cowboy with a poet's heart." "You bring it out in me." Martha smiled, placing his hand on her stomach so he could feel the baby moving. "He or she is active tonight, strong like the mother." Quincy's hand was warm through the thin fabric of her nightgown. "Martha, I want to tell you something I have not said before." "What is it?" "Thank you for giving me this, for trusting me, for building this life with me. You saved me just as much as I saved you that day in the desert. I was existing, not living, before you came. Now every day matters. Every day is a gift." Martha turned in his arms to face him properly, seeing the sincerity shining in his gray eyes. "We saved each other," she said firmly. "This is not about one person rescuing another. This is about 2 people finding each other exactly when they needed to and building something better together than either could have alone." "When did you get so wise?" "When I married a good man who taught me that second chances are real." The baby came in late September, during the cool of early morning when the desert was painted in shades of rose and gold. Martha's labor was hard but straightforward, and Quincy stayed with her throughout despite her protests that it was not proper for men to be present for birthing. "Proper can go hang," he said, holding her hand as another contraction rolled through. "I am not leaving you." The baby, when she finally arrived, was a girl with a surprising amount of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. Quincy held her with shaking hands, tears streaming openly down his face while Martha watched with exhausted joy. "She is perfect," he breathed. "Martha, she is absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Martha asked, though they had discussed names endlessly during the pregnancy. "Rebecca," Quincy said immediately. "After my sister, if you agree." Martha felt tears prick at her own eyes. "Rebecca Sutton, it is perfect." The children were fascinated by their new sister. Thomas held her with careful concentration. Peter wanted to know when she would be old enough to help with the chickens, and the twins fought over who got to rock the cradle. The house that had once seemed almost too large for one man now felt comfortably full, alive with the sounds of family. Martha recovered her strength slowly, grateful for Quincy's help during those first difficult weeks. He took on night feedings without complaint, walking the floor with a crying Rebecca so Martha could sleep. He managed the household and the ranch with Jim's help, never once making Martha feel guilty for needing rest. "You are going to spoil me," she told him one evening, watching him expertly change Rebecca's diaper. "That is the plan. You deserve to be spoiled." By Rebecca's first Christmas, life had settled into a new rhythm. The baby was sleeping through most nights, Thomas was becoming a skilled horseman, Peter's dogs had produced a litter of puppies, and the twins were learning their letters. The ranch was prospering, and Quincy had started talking about buying the adjacent property if it came available. "We need more land if we are going to expand the herd," he explained to Martha one evening, showing her his calculations. "Jim is a good worker, and I think we could hire another hand come spring. With Thomas helping more, we could manage a much larger operation." "You have thought this through," Martha observed, amused by his enthusiasm. "I want to build something lasting, Martha. Something we can pass on to our children and grandchildren. I want this ranch to mean something, to be proof that we were here and we mattered." Martha looked around their comfortable home, at the evidence of their life together everywhere she looked. Children's toys in the corner, Quincy's boots by the door, the music box on the shelf, Rebecca's cradle near the fire. This was what mattered, she thought. Not grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but the daily work of building a life together. "We already matter," she said softly. "Everything we have built here matters. But yes, buy the land if the opportunity comes. Let us keep building." The years flowed past like water, each bringing its own joys and challenges. Martha and Quincy had 2 more children, a boy they named Robert Jackson after Martha's first husband, and another girl they named Elizabeth. Thomas grew into a young man and began courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Peter discovered a talent for veterinary work and began studying under the town doctor. The twins remained inseparable, both developing into capable ranch hands and skilled horsewomen. Through it all, Martha and Quincy's love deepened and strengthened. They had their disagreements. Of course, no marriage is without conflict. But they had learned to talk through their differences, to compromise, to remember that they were partners building something together rather than adversaries fighting for control. On their 10th anniversary, Quincy presented Martha with a deed. "What is this?" she asked, unfolding the official-looking document. "The ranch. In both our names officially. It was always ours together, but I wanted it to be legal. You are co-owner of everything we have built here." Martha felt tears spill over. In an era when women had so few legal rights, when their property and lives were controlled by fathers and husbands, this gesture was more than romantic, it was a statement of true equality. "Quincy Sutton, I love you more today than I did yesterday, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." "That is the plan, Mrs. Sutton. That is absolutely the plan." They stood together on their porch, looking out over the land they had built into a thriving ranch. The house had been expanded twice now, sprawling comfortably with room for their large family. The barn was sturdy and well-maintained, the corrals full of horses. Cattle grazed on their land and chickens pecked in the yard. Children's laughter echoed from the creek where Rebecca was teaching Elizabeth to skip stones while Robert practiced his roping on a fence post. "You ever think about that day in the desert?" Martha asked suddenly. "When you found us, all the time. It was the luckiest day of my life." "I thought it was the unluckiest day of mine at the time. Our wagon had just broken, we were stranded with no hope. I was certain we were going to die out there. And instead you found a life." "No," Martha corrected, leaning against his shoulder. "We found a life, together. You said you had room for 5, and you made room in every way that mattered. You gave us not just space in your house, but space in your heart. You made my children yours, built this ranch into a home, turned a marriage of convenience into a love story." Quincy wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "It is not finished yet. We have many more chapters to write." Yes, Martha agreed, watching the sun paint the Nevada sky in shades of impossible beauty. Many more chapters. Thomas married at 21, bringing his bride Sarah to live in a small house they built on the ranch property. Peter eventually went east to study veterinary medicine formally, returning 3 years later to set up practice in Paradise. The twins both married within a year of each other, Rachel staying on the ranch while Ruth moved to Carson City with her teacher husband. Rebecca, their first child together, grew into a beautiful young woman with her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination. Robert Jackson proved to be a natural rancher, taking over more and more of the daily operations as Quincy aged. Elizabeth was the surprise, the quiet one who loved books more than horses, who eventually became a teacher and opened a school in Paradise. Through all of it, Martha and Quincy remained the steady center. They grew older together, their hair graying, their faces weathering, but their love never diminishing. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, the ranch expanding to accommodate multiple generations all working together. On Martha's 50th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Quincy stood and raised a glass. "To my wife," he said, his voice still strong despite his 62 years. "Who came into my life when we both needed saving, and who has been my partner, my love, and my best friend for 24 years. You are the reason for everything good in my life, Martha Sutton." "Hear, hear." The family chorused, but Martha only had eyes for Quincy, for the man who had said he had room for 5 and had made room for so much more. That night, alone in their bedroom that still held the same bed they had shared since that first real night as husband and wife, Martha held Quincy close. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what? For finding us that day, for offering help when we had no hope, for loving my children as your own, for giving me a second chance at happiness when I thought that part of my life was over. For 24 years of being exactly the man I needed. Martha, I should be thanking you. You took a chance on a lonely cowboy who barely knew how to talk to people. You made me a father, a husband, a grandfather. You filled my house with love and laughter. You made my life matter." "We made each other's lives matter," Martha said firmly. "That is what partnership means." They fell asleep that way, wrapped together as they had been for over 2 decades, and Martha dreamed of the desert, of a dust storm and a broken wagon, and a moment of despair that had transformed into the greatest blessing of her life. The years continued their inexorable march. Quincy's hair went fully white, and he moved slower, relying more on Robert Jackson and Thomas to handle the heavy ranch work. Martha's hands developed arthritis, making sewing and detailed work difficult, but she still cooked and managed the household with her daughters and daughters-in-law. They celebrated their 30th anniversary quietly, just the two of them on the porch where they had spent so many evenings talking and dreaming and planning. 30 years, Quincy said wonderingly. "When I rode out that August morning to check on cattle, I had no idea I was riding toward my destiny." "Do you believe in destiny?" Martha asked. "That we were meant to find each other?" "I believe we found each other exactly when we needed to. Whether that is destiny or pure luck, I do not know. But I am grateful for it either way. I grieved Robert for so long after his death. I felt guilty for finding happiness with you so quickly. But now, looking back, I understand that I was allowed to have 2 great loves in my life. Robert gave me my first 4 children and taught me what marriage could be. You gave me a home when I had none, love when I thought that chapter was closed, and showed me that the heart is capable of healing and loving again. I am grateful for both of you." "That is a good way to look at it," Quincy agreed. "Robert was a lucky man to have you, even if his time was too short. I am a lucky man to have you now." And someday, when we are both gone, our children and grandchildren will tell stories about the widow with 4 children and no hope, and the cowboy who said he had room for 5. That is a good story, Martha said, smiling. A true one, which is the best kind. The best kind indeed. Quincy lived to see his 78th year, dying peacefully in his sleep on a cool autumn night. Martha held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped, and though grief threatened to overwhelm her, she felt gratitude too. Gratitude for 34 years together, for the life they had built, for every moment they had been given. At his funeral, the church in Paradise was packed with family, friends, and people whose lives Quincy had touched. Martha stood straight and strong, surrounded by her 7 children, 4 by birth and 3 by the heart of the man they were burying, and listened as person after person testified to Quincy's kindness, his generosity, his fundamental decency. "He saved us," Martha said when it was her turn to speak. "My children and I were dying in the desert, and he saved us. But more than that, he gave us a home, a family, a life worth living. He took on 4 children who were not his own and loved them as fiercely as he loved the 3 we had together. He built a ranch that has supported multiple generations. He was a good man, the best man, and I am grateful beyond measure for every day we had together." Her voice broke on the last words, and Thomas came to stand beside her, his own eyes wet with tears. At 45, Martha's eldest son was a grandfather himself. But in that moment, he was once again the 11-year-old boy who had watched a stranger offer help when hope was lost. "Pa Quincy used to tell me that family is not just about blood," Thomas said, taking over when Martha could not continue. "It is about showing up, about doing the work, about loving people even when it is difficult. He showed up for us when he had no obligation to. He did the work of being a father when he could have just been a benefactor. He loved us unconditionally, and he taught us how to be good people by being one himself. We will miss him terribly, but we will honor him by living the way he taught us to live, with kindness, integrity, and love." They buried Quincy on a hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot he had picked out years before. Martha planted wildflowers on his grave, the hardy desert blooms that somehow thrived in the harsh Nevada soil. She lived another 12 years without him, staying strong and active into her 70s. She watched her grandchildren have children of their own, saw the ranch continue to prosper under Robert Jackson's capable management, and took joy in the family that had grown from that desperate moment in the desert so many decades before. On her last day, surrounded by family in the bedroom she had shared with Quincy for so many years, Martha felt at peace. Her children held her hands, and she looked at each beloved face: Thomas, now gray-haired and weathered, Peter with his kind doctor's eyes, the twins, still finishing each other's sentences at 63, Rebecca, the image of her father, Robert Jackson, strong and capable, Elizabeth, the scholar of the family. "I am proud of all of you," she said, her voice thin but clear. "You have built good lives, raised good children. You honor both of your fathers with the people you have become." "We learned from the best," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. "Tell my story," Martha said as her vision began to blur. "Tell your children and grandchildren about the widow with 4 children and no hope, and the cowboy who said he had room for 5. Tell them that love can come from unexpected places, that family is what you make it, and that there is always reason to hope, even in the darkest moments." "We will," Thomas promised. "We will tell it, Mama. We promise." Martha smiled and closed her eyes and felt herself drifting away. But she was not afraid, because she knew she was going toward something good, toward reunion with the 2 men she had loved, toward peace and rest after a life well lived. The story of Martha Hayes Sutton and Quincy Sutton became legend in Paradise, Nevada, passed down through generations of their descendants. The ranch they built together remained in the family for over 100 years, a testament to what can be created when two people find each other in desperate circumstances and choose to build something lasting together. Every August, on the anniversary of that fateful day when a widow with 4 children met a cowboy with room for 5, the family gathered at the graves on the hill overlooking the ranch. They brought wildflowers and told the story again, making sure the youngest children understood where they came from, what their ancestors had survived, and how love and kindness had transformed desperation into dynasty. The house still stood, expanded and modernized, but still fundamentally the same structure Quincy had built with his own hands. The barn had been rebuilt twice, but always in the same location. The creek still ran where Martha had once washed 4 exhausted children. And on the porch where Martha and Quincy had spent so many evenings talking and dreaming, their descendants still gathered to watch the desert sunsets paint the Nevada sky in impossible colors. It was, everyone agreed, a love story for the ages. Not the dramatic romance of novels, with grand gestures and sweeping declarations, but something better, a real love, built on mutual respect and shared work, and the daily choice to care for each other. It was the story of 2 people who found each other when they both needed saving, who built a life together from nothing but determination and hope and love, and who left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew across the ranch in just the right way, old-timers swore you could hear laughter from that first summer, when a widow and 4 children found refuge with a lonely cowboy, and everyone discovered that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, built not from blood alone but from love and need, and the simple courage to offer help when it is desperately needed. The story was true, every word of it, and that made it more powerful than any fiction. It was proof that in the harsh landscape of the American West, in the brutal heat of the Nevada desert, in the midst of grief and loss and desperation, there was still room for hope, still space for love, still possibility for second chances and new beginnings. The widow had 4 children and no hope. The cowboy said he had room for 5. And from that unlikely beginning, they built something beautiful that would echo through time, a family, a legacy, a love story that proved that sometimes, when you least expect it, salvation comes riding out of the desert dust on a reliable horse, wearing a weathered hat and speaking with quiet kindness. And that, as their great-great-grandchildren would say while sitting on that same porch watching that same sunset, was how the Sutton family began, with an offer of help, an acceptance born of desperation, and a love that grew slowly but surely until it could not be denied. It was how 2 strangers became partners, how partners became lovers, how lovers became the foundation of something that would outlast them both. It was, simply put, exactly what was meant to be, and that was the best kind of story there was.